Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Yesterday I put out a video where literally all I did was read a story about Scarlet Briar. Scarlet Briar being the villain in the most recent Living World updates. ArenaNet put out a very interesting story. It was quite a long story, which is why it's a video all on its own, where they talked about a lot of very curious things to do with the universe and the mists and the nature of Tyria itself. So today, it might not be such a long video, but I'd like to talk about what I drew from the story. Take a knee, and I guess we'll see what we found. Okay, so I see this story as two things, really. First, it's a minor insight into how the universe works. Of course, we get a lot of stuff with Scarlet here, actually going inside the mist and exploring it in a way that actually isn't too dissimilar that we've heard a lot of other characters and creatures and things have done in this universe, and I'll be talking about that in a second. But I think that's obviously a key part of this story. But also, this story is mainly, I think, it's best as a story that shows you the transformation of Scarlet. I do think there are still some pretty big pieces of the puzzle missing, which I'm going to call out on it as we get to it, because I'm going to sort of go in chronological order. But in general, what we are seeing, and I think is very nice about this story, is a Sylvari that comes out of the pale tree and is relishing in the wet grass beneath her feet and taking in the majesty of life, and has this thirst for knowledge and in particular creation at first too. And I guess still to an extent creation, and how slowly over learning more about the universe, she becomes corrupt and evil. And I think that story at its core, just this idea that a character like a Sylvari, who even though, yes, they are persuaded by the pale tree, are sort of inherently neutral in my eyes. They're a very kind of neutral race, and they just see and they learn. Though I guess the argument can be made that they're not very neutral because they're there to fight the Elder Dragons. But what we're seeing is that you can take a character that literally has a neutral stance at first and just wants to learn about the world, and because of the nature of this universe, the lore of this world, that has set her on a dark path. And it's quite a thrilling idea to me that maybe a lot of characters would go down this same route. Who in Tyria has the mental aptitude to understand the universe and remain pure of intent and want to preserve what Tyria currently is? Because I suppose that's what the good idea is right now. It's we want to preserve Tyria, we want to save Tyria, that's the whole idea. And yet we're seeing time after time these characters like Scarlet, by the end of this story, is happy to essentially burn down the existing world and rule whatever rises from the ashes. It's a lot like a line from Game of Thrones, actually, that springs to my mind. So I think the story is incredibly powerful in that respect, and I really like that now we do have this greater insight into Scarlet. Once again, I'm just going to keep saying it, why aren't these in game? Please, this would be amazing. How many people are going to miss this because there's no indication of it in game? How are ArenaNet going to translate all of these motivations and complex history of Scarlet effectively in game? They can't really, but they do have a great story, so why don't we just have like Emissary Vorp be like, hey, I found this thing that's like, I don't know, a journal, but I used my magic stuff to draw a lot more out of it, and we've learned all this stuff about Scarlet. I don't know. Anyway, so let's go in chronological order. First thing that I found really cool as I was reading through this was, of course, we know her by a different name. I'm going to have to put a disclaimer. I might be saying her name wrong. Ciara? It could be Kiara, I guess, but it's a C, right? So I'm guessing that's an S sound. Whatever, we hear her original Sylvari name, and this was very interesting to me immediately because Scarlet Briar, yes, it's kind of a Sylvari sounding name. I mean, Briar, if you guys don't know, it's sort of a generic term for thorn bushes, right? Kind of thorny plants, just sort of a generic term to apply to them. But her name is Scarlet Briar. That's two names. Sylvari don't really take two names. Scarlet, I guess, again, is also sort of a Sylvari-ish name. But there was always this question, why has she got two names? Why is this Sylvari sort of different to the other Sylvari in that she's got these two names? And immediately with this story, they kind of show, hey, that they're answering this. And of course, the answer to that is quite clear, really, now. She gave the name to herself, which is very fitting with her motivations and who she is as a character, right? She's paving her own way. A name is a very interesting concept of our society in real life, and it's portrayed in a lot of these games. But, you know, it's a massive part of who you are, and you didn't choose it, right? So for ArenaNet to invent this character whose overarching theme is I'm making my own decisions, and then have her creating her own name be a part of that, I think is really smart and a really cool thing to do. Scarlet Briar, she chose this name presumably because of the vision she saw in the mist, right? This thorn, this briar choking the pale tree, and just this scarlet red imagery that she saw, and she just names herself after that, I guess, fever dreamish image she saw of the pale tree, of her choking the pale tree. And of course, early on in the story we don't get that answer, but I enjoyed that straight away, and I think a lot more casual people looking at the story won't have even twigged that Scarlet Briar in the first place was a weird name for her to have had. The other thing I really enjoy about this story that I don't think is meant to be a major piece of it, but I enjoy that this story helps us to define in our minds and puts into practice the differences between the colleges. The colleges sort of have very little role to play early on in personal story stuff if you're an Asura, and even if you do go through the Asura personal story stuff just on one character, you're not really going to have a solid idea of the difference between all the colleges. Actually, in-game, there's very little areas you can go to learn about the differences between them. You can be a particularly perceptive player, and there was a lot of alliteration there. You can be a particularly perceptive player and go to Ratasum and speak to sort of the characters of the respective colleges, but you won't really get that much. Most of this came from before the game came out, where Arena Net were like, look, we've got all these ideas for what these colleges are like, but there was never really any solid story or anything that showed us how the difference between them could affect stuff. I don't know, I guess what I'm saying is this is really nice to ground in people's minds the difference between the colleges, because I'll say it myself, off of the top of my head, I couldn't immediately say, oh, this is the difference between synergetics and the other colleges, and I think your average player couldn't do that either. But if your average player has now read this story, we all kind of understand straight away what synergetics is all about. It's the college that never really produces particularly tangible stuff, but they're trying to tackle the big questions. It's the Asuran equivalent of philosophy, right? And what they learn can then enable the other colleges to create things, but in general, they spend all their times up in their minds and find questions that don't have definitive answers. And that's really well displayed in this story, about how we have Scarlet just ace 2 of the colleges and then find a challenge in the 3rd. That's good. That expresses the difference between these colleges can have an impact on the characters in the world. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. The next thing that I wrote down as a note here is I really enjoy that a lot of the characters that we meet in this story were in-game at some point, or are still in-game. Who's one of the first characters we meet? Well, Omad we don't meet because he's dead before the events of Guild Wars 2. But the first other character we meet is the Mender that sees Ciara as she first is born into Tyria, right? This Mender you can actually go to Astoria Village, which is where new Sylvari characters in Guild Wars 2 are created, where they are born, and you can speak to this exact same Sylvari. I think that is really cool. I think he's the first Sylvari all Sylvari to undertake the personal story will speak to. Like, as soon as you get out of the dream, he's the guy you go and speak to. I think that's awesome, and it's really now interesting for me to look at that character and be like, damn, imagine all the Sylvari this dude has interacted with. Every single player character Sylvari, and potentially dozens of other important ones as a part of the story. I think that's really cool, and I would love it if somehow we could go and speak to this character now in the next bit of Living World and be like, hey, do you remember this Scarlet person? What was going on there? And he'll be like, oh, this was her original name, and then we learn things, you know? In addition to the Mender as well, Bagarth, this esteemed Norn, that dude is in game as well. This is a Norn that tapped into how the dwarves made their steel. He like can replicate Deldrimor steel, and in Guild Wars 1 that was like a very rare crafting material that was used for top end armors, and as the dwarves turned to stone and died out, the knowledge of creating this incredible alloy was lost. But Bagarth is this great forge smith that we hear about in Scarlet's story. In game you can learn more about this dude, and he's the guy responsible for that. And if you guys remember, when you're forming the pact with Traherne, there's a moment in Timberline Falls where you go to sort of an outpost and a lot of forge smiths sort of gather. One of them's a Tengu, but the other one is Bagarth. He's this legendary Norn forge smith, and he's a part of the pact and the core story of Guild Wars 2. And now we learn a bit about this guy's history as well. He trained who could be potentially the next big villain, the next big megalomaniac in this game's story. So Bagarth as well could come forward. This is nice to me. I like that ArenaNet are looking at these characters that they've littered around the world, and where relevant, putting them into contemporary stories. I mean, this is a story about in the past, but it's contemporary because it's relevant to Living World stuff right now. The other character too is Teo. Teo will appear, I think it's actually even Synergetics. If you pick a Synergetics Asura, I could be wrong on that, but if you pick a certain college Asura, Teo will be there. She's this villain of your personal story, and you end up fighting her and killing her at the end of the level story stuff. So again, another character, an Asura from the Inquest that was working very closely with Scarlet that teleported away. This is a character we saw in game and personally dealt with if you were an Asuran player. What you've got to consider too, that they mention Teo in this story, is that this is comprehensive proof that ArenaNet did, while writing this living story stuff, have in mind those early personal story things to do with the Asura, right? One of the big things, to go to this whole Aetherblade, steam creatures, shards theory thing, right? One of the things that really sort of makes me question that stuff is, did ArenaNet really have the foresight to go back or think about a random character like Shod? They've got a massive game, tons of characters. Did they even consider it, right? And this story here sort of proves, yes, they probably did. Because, no, we're not seeing Shod in this story, but we are seeing another seemingly very small character from early personal story. So if they're showing us Teo here, it sort of seems more likely in my mind that they did see Shod and they did consider Shod, and that this could all be related to all that stuff anyway. That's one nice thing I like about this. It's sort of proof that, yes, they are going back to these really minor characters back there. Another thing on that note about Teo too, this idea that Teo just teleports away, leaving Scarlet alone to get caught, that's very interesting to me. This is a completely different tangent, but this is very interesting to me because a big thing I've been speculating on and that's got sort of gripped me is Scarlet's ability to teleport all over the place and have all of her forces teleport all over the place and tap into this other dimension that we know the steam creatures are from and bring them in. She might have no part in how they were constructed or any of the story to do with them, but she at least can bring them in, right? She's got all of these kind of teleporting abilities, and I always kind of thought this was as a result of her looking into the Eternal Alchemy and basically doing what we see in the story, but actually the story kind of proves otherwise. This is probably just an Inquest thing, right? Teleportation, I guess, for Guild Wars 2's terms, isn't really that special anymore. Asura gates, waypoints, multiple professions have abilities like this. I guess it's just a pretty standard thing, really, and I was just looking too far into it. Maybe all of her teleportation just comes from her brief period of time working with the Inquest. Teo, of course, teleports away. I wonder why Scarlet doesn't have the ability to teleport away at that point. Maybe there's a suggestion there that she stayed on purpose, but who knows. One other discrepancy as well I'm kind of curious about is in-game, Emissary Vorp, before this story came out, Emissary Vorp told us that Scarlet had been to all the colleges. He told us that she'd studied with the Norn and even the Hylek, but he told us she'd got special dispensation to get into the colleges. I took that to mean that someone, like, funded her to go, that, like, she had to pay or something. But I guess, no, this was just that she proved to have her own golem. So we're really not looking at, oh, there's someone else above the chain. A lot of people have likened Scarlet Briar to Harley Quinn, right? And everyone's like, okay, so who's Guild Wars 2's Joker? And that's not a concept that I particularly disagreed with or thought might be boring, but it doesn't look like ArenaNet are going that way. And I guess it is nice now to know for a fact, hey, we're probably at the top of the chain. She doesn't really seem like she's got any more accomplices. She's just walked out on everyone she's ever known. And that idea of her walking out as well on everyone is another thing I really found quite compelling about this story. As I say, I think one of the main things that this story is trying to articulate to us is her transformation, right? And one of the things, it sort of hit me as I was reading the story, just as she leaves the Hylek, ArenaNet just throwing that sentence, she leaves the Hylek without saying a word. And when I first read it, I thought to myself, oh, that seems kind of stupid. They've just been telling us how she leaves everyone every time. They didn't really have to tell us that, did they? But actually, I think they did. I think what they're doing is every time she comes to a new area and she's learning new things, she is a student of someone else's, they give us this information about her leaving, because that's what she does. She doesn't care about anyone else. She's just there in the pursuit of knowledge, and she leaves. She leaves again. She leaves again. And at the start, you know, when we're with Bagarth, she's quite polite about it, and they leave on pretty good terms, so it would seem. You know, he's not happy about it, but they leave on pretty good terms. And then slowly, as things progress, eventually, she's just walked away from the Hylek without saying a damn word to them, and finally, with Omad, she kills him, right? This shows her descent into what she has become that we now see in Guild Wars 2. I think that's really nice. I really actually enjoyed that. When I was reading that for the second time, and I was catching it every single time, I was like, this is just showing how she changes. And there's a lot of stuff in the story that's showing how she slowly changes. I think that the whole Hylek bit in general felt sort of shoehorned in. I don't know whether ArenaNet just sort of want to say, hey, yeah, there was this Hylek thing. This explains, I guess, some of what we see aesthetically on her minions, perhaps, or whether that will have more of a role to play in future. I have a feeling it could be the latter, or at least I hope it's the latter, because otherwise it does feel kind of shoehorned. But maybe that's just me being a bit of a picky nerd. I mean, more story is more story. I'm not going to complain about that. Another thing around this area of the story as well, of course, they mentioned the SNAF prize, this whole thing with the Inquest. I am curious. I haven't looked into the research for this. If I spent the time to, I I probably could. I am curious whether they're specifically mentioning this SNAF prize competition, because that is somehow tied in. Like, if you were to play through the SNAF prize stuff as an actual Asuran character, you might see some of what the Inquest are doing this year's SNAF prize that harkens back to why they're doing it, because it was related to the Scarlet incident the year before. Perhaps, I'm not sure, but I do like that they mentioned the SNAF prize, of course. I'm pretty sure it's an annual event. I'm pretty sure it might be like semi-annual. I couldn't really find any dialogue about it, but it's nice to see, you know. And also, it's just another tiny little thing, okay? The SNAF prize moment where they mentioned that, for me, that is one of those points where you're reading this story and you're into this story about this very specific character and this very specific thing that's going on. And then they mention something, just in passing, the SNAF prize, and then instantly that opens up your mind and reminds you of everything that happened in Edge of Destiny and this whole other side of Tyrion, this whole other world. And it happens again when she mentions Caithe and Faolain. Makes you realise, oh man, this feels like it's everything, this story, while you're in the moment, and then really, no, it's just a part of a vast universe. I think that is the beauty that comes from having a very broad world with plenty of depth that you can only get after a really long time of having developed whatever your franchise is. I think that was a really cool moment. But okay, let's look at the vision within the mist, the vision itself. What did Scarlet see? The whole piece is named after this. I feel like this is probably the meat and bones. So what exactly is it showing us? For me, the story opens where we have Omad saying, oh, she's hooked up to this machine. Instantly, I was wrapped up in the story because my main question was, okay, what is this machine? How does this machine work? What's the concept here? How did we get to this place? And then the story does go back in time and try to tell us that. But I'm not very satisfied with what the machine does. What did we get, really? We got Magitech Asura speak. We didn't get any real understanding of how that machine works. And that's okay, I think, fine. You can suspend your disbelief to a certain point and just say it's magic. How much explanation do you want? But I do want that little bit more clarification, because we need to understand how what Scarlet did here is different to everyone else that's traveling in the mist that we've come across in this franchise. Right back to Lord Odrin, okay? This dude that started opening portals and traveling around the mists. The gods themselves, a suggestion that they are mere mortal beings at one point, but that now have just learned how to traverse the mists. These are all characters that are just sort of traveling around the mist, and I think that's another big theme, actually, of this. How close to godlike is Scarlet now? They describe the Pale Tree as godlike, and Scarlet is sort of meeting with the Pale Tree against the Pale Tree's own terms in this story, so where does that put Scarlet? I think that's a big question here. But back to my point, we've had a lot of characters go into the mists in this universe. Probably one of the most widespread right now are the Norn. The only reason, really, the Norn are of any particular interest to me is they have runes at the moment, okay? Because the Norn have this innate ability, this incredible ability to just slip into the mist, but only a few of them. And how is that different to what we've just seen Scarlet do? Because there are a lot of similarities here. And then you can look at the Kodan as well, with their sort of mists madness with their shamans in their sanctuaries. And lastly as well, another important character that I really like some contrast with for Scarlet is at the end of Ra Path 4. A lot of people, I think, probably haven't played Ra Path 4. It took me a long time to do it, but that story is fascinating there. This is the story of a human that wants to learn about the Bloodstones, and in doing so he ends up sort of fighting lots of priests of the human gods and tapping into the essence of the human's god, and at the end he travels to the mists himself. Through the power of the Bloodstones, he in his entirety disappears from Tyria and ascends to the mist, and as he goes he talks about going to meet the gods and going to learn about the universe, right? That's very similar to what we see Scarlet doing, but how can we even begin to predict where the story might go or speculate if we don't know that they are the same thing necessarily? This is just an Asuran version of what we saw that human do. But again, this human come back? Is it going to be like this human guy that does this but isn't corrupted by it like Scarlet was, and then they fight? I mean, that's an option, right? But it's so out of the blue and disconnected right now because all we know is these are just people that have gone to the mists. There are so many different ways you can go to the mists. That's what I'm saying. That makes that feel a bit crappy to me. But anyway, this machine, however it works, Scarlet goes in and we do get a very vivid, very compelling scene, lots of really nice imagery of what's going on as she's inside there. They could have been really bad about this. It could have just been from Omad's perspective and that's it, right? And that would have just been terrible. But no, we get to go in there, and that's why this story is so incredibly fascinating. And I guess the first main thing that made me go, holy shit, was the Pale Tree suddenly talking to her. How cool is that? So we know that the Pale Tree has this ability to speak to specific Sylvari, and it has done on many occasions. We know that some Sylvari turn their back on the Pale Tree and completely disconnect themselves from it, but this time we have the Pale Tree pleading with Scarlet, please don't look into what I am, essentially, right? I mean, that's what I took from it. She's saying, don't learn about the universe, because by learning about it, you will unleash things that unhinge it. What are the Pale Tree's motivations here? Particularly the line, okay, this is what I loved most about the Pale Tree bit. Particularly the line, if you are not what you were born to be, you are lost. Worse, you are dangerous, is thrilling to me. That calls for me into question what the Pale Tree even is in terms of its motivations. It doesn't want its minions, its Sylvari, to turn its back on it, obviously, but there's clearly something more here. Later on in the story, we're going to hear Scarlet talking about great forces that are in the world, presumably talking about the Elder Dragons, and how she's going to set them against one another, and how she seems to understand more about them. I've got to be honest, a lot of people really frown at it, but I think, again, this might add some leverage, perhaps, to the idea that the Pale Tree is very much tied to the Elder Dragon cycle. Whether she is a champion of an Elder Dragon or a dragon herself, or whatever you want to believe, she is definitely tied into the cycle of the Elder Dragons very much, it would seem. And now I think Scarlet understands that full picture. That's what this story is trying to tell us. Now, Scarlet's response to this, dangerous you say, so be it, I find sort of hard to buy. This story, as I say, a big piece of the story is sort of how she changes from being a regular Sylvari to what she is now, right? Why does seeing this change her from just having a thirst for knowledge and a thirst for the understanding of the universe to now relishing in being dangerous? I think to a small extent it works, and I think she could feel quite injured and upset by the fact that she's being forced to be something. I think that's, we're talking about freedom, basically, right? We're talking about free will and rejecting this idea of a birthright or destiny that you have to be something because someone else dictates it. That's what we're talking about, and that's something I think a lot of us can empathize with. So maybe the whole idea is that she's just been wounded by the tree, this concept, and now she's just gone swung off in the complete other direction, and now she wants to be dangerous and bring chaos to the world. I think that's what ArenaNet are trying to go for, and I think it does make sense to an extent, but not enough to make her into this crazy megalomaniac, right? They say, with the Pale Tree's desperate words and her own raucous laughter echoing across the void, Sierra plunged through the vision of the great tree and beyond. So now we don't get to see what she sees. We've seen a little bit of what she saw in the mist. We've seen that the Pale Tree is invested. We've seen that the Pale Tree believes she is this thorn that is strangling it. Something completely unakin to the Nightmare Court, potentially worse than the Nightmare Court, and the Pale Tree doesn't like her at all. That's what we get to see. We get some really very cool imagery. I love this idea of the seeing Tyria in amongst chaos storms and clouds of potentiality. I think that sounded really beautiful. There's a lot of really nice imagery here, but that's what we get. Then we know that she continues through the mists, but we get nothing more. We last leave Scarlet Briar as relishing in being dangerous, and then when she comes out, she just murders this guy, and now she has an entirely new motivation. This motivation is what's driving her to do everything we're doing in the living story right now, okay? If she just had a thirst for knowledge and stuff, she wouldn't be attacking Divinity's Reach and doing all these crazy things, right? But now that she's seen this off-screen stuff, all of a sudden, oh, this is our explanation for why she now wants to rule. This idea that she wants to rule and put her stamp on whatever the new world becomes, that is the important bit, and that's the bit that we completely miss. This is her whole motivation for why she's being evil and attacking people, and that's the bit that they explain with, oh, it's something she saw in the mist. What did she see in the mist? Well, she saw this thing about the Pale Tree. Does that explain it? No, not really. She saw some other stuff too. Well, what was that? Oh, we're not going to tell you. That left a sour taste for me. It really did. Right at the end of the story, all this amazing stuff, and I've got to be blunt about it, that kind of annoyed me. I was like, man, this is the one thing. This whole story is about how she becomes what she becomes, and we get sort of half of it, and then they just sort of throw the other half. That disappointed me about the story, but in general, I'm incredibly glad that we got to see what happened inside the mists. Of course, it's not particularly concrete. We do get a tantalizing line here about setting that there are forces in motion that the Pale Tree wants us to fight, i.e. probably the Elder Dragons, right? That's what the Pale Tree wants us to fight, the Elder Dragons. Scarlet says, I reject that. and I'm going to pit these forces against one another to both of their detriments. Now, is she talking about setting elder dragons against one another? This has been an established concept that could happen in this story for a long time. We've always known that the elder dragons do not necessarily get along. They're not best of buddies. They're just elemental forces that have rose up to suck magic, the excess amounts of magic that are flowing around the ley lines beneath Tyria. They don't necessarily like one another. ArenaNet have never been shy about telling us that. I do think eventually we will have freaking, I don't know, Kraugatoric versus Primordus versus Scarlet or something. You know, I think this kind of stuff now is a very real possibility, and I think that's Scarlet's plan. How everything she did in Divinity's Reach affects that, I don't know. Maybe she's just cracked now and she just wants to cause fights wherever she possibly can in an attempt to lure the Elder Dragons out. Maybe there's a bigger story going on. Whatever that story is, we still don't have it. This was a tantalizing look, though. I wish it was slightly more concrete. I wish we'd learned a little bit more about Omad's experiment. I wish they would bind it more closely to all of the other stuff we have about people traveling around the mists. They need to really unify all of this stuff, because whenever the mists are involved, it's like everyone's got a different story about their experiences of it. And I love the mystery and the perplexity of it and the paradoxes that it provides, because that's what the mists are all about, really. But at the same time, I do think, when are we going to get something concrete? Maybe that's just my own thirst of the universe, my own desire for more knowledge about it. And unlike Scarlet, I'm just a player of the game and I have to wait for ArenaNet to tell us. The question is, to me now though, every time something like this comes up, we don't get the full picture. I'm always just thinking, when is the time that we get this concrete stuff? And is that time ever going to come? To hear what you think. I haven't been looking on forums or anything. Are there any other interesting theories? Do let me know. I will catch people up if there are. Thanks guys again. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time for more lore, PvP, story time, whatever. I'm not quite sure yet.